This is a presentation of the Cornell Cooperative Extension Program Development Curriculum 142, Getting Started with Program Evaluation. We cover a broad range of topics from evaluation fundamentals, useful concepts, available methods, and successful strategies for conducting program evaluation as part of your work at Cornell Cooperative Extension. I want to be clear that this is an introductory section on program evaluation. It's really meant to get you to start to build in evaluation thinking and practice as you conduct your work. We are fortunate to have available in-depth resources related to program evaluation through the Cornell Office for Research on Evaluation, with which CCE has been partnering for more than 5 years. To find the Cornell Office for Research on Evaluation, simply search on the title. Any place on the Cornell website, you'll come to this page. And in particular, there is a new guide to evaluation protocol under latest news that is just an exceptional resource for planning evaluation. So if you go through this course and want to go a little bit further, there's an exceptional resource. And I wanted to pitch that right up front in our presentation. We'll start with some basic aspects of evaluation, looking at different forms and purposes, clear up a little bit of language, and try to demonstrate the relationship of program evaluation to the overall program development process. We could play a little bit of Jeopardy and look at different definitions of evaluation, but this is a typical textbook evaluation. We could play a little Jeopardy and look at different definitions of evaluation, but this is a typical definition, textbook definition, whereby you systematically collect information to provide feedback about some object, in our case, about a program. That looks pretty antiseptic, and I actually prefer this particular definition that it stresses that it's both a mental and social process, a thought process and a social process. Most of our programs are conducted with a variety of people involved, and there are different stakeholders who are interested in our programs and their evaluation. And we're basically comparing what we think should be with the way programs actually play out. So I think this conveys more of the complexity of program evaluation, particularly in our setting. There are a variety of forms of evaluation that range from casual observation to use of voluntary feedback or anecdotes from participants, to collectively as teaching teams conducting a post-mortem or a review to figure out what worked and what didn't work about programs, to gathering immediate feedback from participants, often with simple feedback forms or perhaps a quick conversation. Casual follow-up, wherein perhaps we run into participants another time and ask whether they found a particular program to be of value, or in some cases our participants offer that information voluntarily. To systematic feedback, where we actually intentionally pull a sample to find out whether participants in fact applied information from our efforts, and all the way out to formal or scientific evaluation, which we don't do a lot of, but sometimes use comparison groups and other more formal attempts to assess our program effectiveness. The point about the slide is that these are all potentially valid forms of evaluation, and what is critical is to match the form to your specific needs and purposes. There are a variety of reasons or purposes for conducting evaluation, and I'd like to show you a classic way of thinking about this. This is the model initially developed by Daniel Stufflebeam at University of Illinois, and it's known as the CIPP model. And we'll see where that comes from in just a minute here. I'll populate the grid, and starting in the upper left, Context evaluation is early planning for programs. You can think of it as needs assessment, understanding the context for the program, what are the specific programming opportunities. And lots of times people would not necessarily identify that as part of program evaluation, but in this model it certainly is a valid form. Input evaluation is basically looking at the resources that are needed and available for conducting a program. So again, on the planning side, you're trying to figure out what you have to work with, what you need to work with in order to conduct a programmatic effort. Wrapping around counterclockwise, when you're in the process of implementation, process evaluation looks at how well things are going. Did we choose the right methods? Did we choose the right venues? Are we reaching the right audience, etc.? So how are things going? And then product evaluation, which is what people tend to think of evaluation as, is what results are we getting? Are those results the ones we intended to get or not? Using this model, we can also find some other typical language about evaluation. Context and input evaluation together are what's often called formative evaluation, and you can think of that as planning or evaluation that you'd be doing during the planning phases. Summative evaluation basically is looking at what happened, both in terms of process and product. And if you look a little further into the grid, context and input is starting to shape intended outcomes. Process and product evaluation looks at actual outcomes. And going across the grid, context and product evaluation look at the ends you're trying to achieve, and then input and process evaluation looks at the means by which you would attempt to reach those ends. So a lot of information, a lot of different kinds of evaluation wrapped up in this particular model. If you take that model or accept that model, it's really easy to relate different kinds of evaluation to the program development process. Program planning looks at the context and input evaluation in the CCEPDC model, looking at needs, looking at resources. Program implementation includes process evaluation, really looking at things like assessing program quality and opportunities for improvement. And evaluation of results and outcomes picks up on the product evaluation from the CIPP model. And we start to look at things like return on investment, whether a program was worth resources invested in it. So again, if you have a broad take on evaluation purposes, it's very easy to relate it to the multiple phases of program development. One of the sort of precepts to this overall module is that really the evaluation process needs to start with an understanding of how the program is supposed to work. So evaluation starts with program design. One of the best tools for doing that is program logic models, and we'll spend a little bit of time with that in a few minutes. But specifying not only goals and objectives, but how the activities and inputs relate to those all helps to set up the evaluation process. You can start to think about what are your critical evaluation questions, what are the needs, even before the program begins. And that gives you the opportunity to build in documentation, process assessment, and near-term outcome assessment without evaluation becoming an end game, after-the-fact game. So next we'll move to some of the approaches or tools that have proven very useful in the planning phases of program evaluation. And the three we'll look at are logic models, levels of evidence, and program lifecycle. The logic model has become the standard format of evaluation plans of work nationally, and it's the recommended format for us in Cornell Cooperative Extension. It's also used by many other agencies and organizations. And it's basically a systems model that has you identify inputs, outputs, and outcomes of programs. The inputs looking at the resources that you invest, the outputs being the activities and the participation you gain, and then the outcomes being the results that you generate. If you look further down, the outcome framework from the model that we use, the University of Wisconsin Extension model, identifies short-term outcomes in terms of learning or skills acquisition, midterm outcomes in terms of practice changes or application, and then long-term outcomes being those end results, changes in circumstance that happen over the longer haul toward which our programs are directed. Having this type of framework or description of your program really starts to set up evaluation questions you can ask. Quite simply, did we deliver what we intended to? Did we meet our milestones? What actually happened? Are we achieving the outcome indicators that we intended to? And you can start to think about not only what questions to ask, but when to ask them in the conduct of the program. Another model that's proven very useful is Bennett's level of evidence. And this was a standard for extension systems for many, many years and still is, particularly in international development fields. And basically what it says is that over time, from start to finish of a program, different kinds of evidence are available to you to focus on program implementation and then eventually outcomes and impact. Another notion implied by the arrow on the left is that the effort involved in conducting evaluation also increases as you go through time. So let's look at what populates this chart. In terms of early stages of implementation, evidence about inputs basically is characterizing what did we invest, what did it take to do this program, and it's the basis for return on investment kinds of evaluations. It's the basis for making choices against different methods or approaches, understanding what inputs are required. Activities that would be evidence that describes what you actually achieved, what you actually carried out, I should say, and what your participation was. Did you reach targeted participation? Did you engage the audiences that you intended to or not? And that spills into the notion of involvement. How many and who did we reach in our various activities? Moving a little further through the model, those participants that you do gain involvement from are going to react to your program, and this is the opportunity to provide you a sense of customer satisfaction. It doesn't say much, if anything at all, about your educational outcomes, but simply knowing whether or not people are responding well to a program can be a critical consideration in your choices of method and approach. So it's not inconsequential information at all. KASA stands for knowledge, attitudes, skills, and aspirations. Those are near-term outcomes in the University of Wisconsin logic model. What did people learn differently? Do they have at least a neutral, if not a positive attitude towards whatever the subject was? Do they have the requisite skills? And do they aspire to apply it? So think of aspirations often when we're dealing with practice change as a measure of intent to apply. And then moving on to the balance of the model, we eventually get practice changes where people start implementing what we've been teaching, leading towards long-term results. If you look at this for a couple of minutes and then sort of envision rotating it to the right, you'll see that it directly reflects the structure of a logic model. And the difference here is it's really trying to get you to think about what kinds of evidence do I need? Am I focused on assessing implementation? Then these are some of the kinds of evidence that might be relevant. If I'm shifting more towards outcome and impact assessment, then knowledge gains and practice changes are probably going to be premier information needs. Just to sort of hammer that a little bit more, the notion of matching evidence to your purposes. So if you're really considering evaluation from the standpoint of program improvement, getting better at something you already have in place, then the kinds of evidence might include involvement, reactions, and then the near-term changes. If you're conducting the evaluation for external program accountability to a funder, you're likely going to want to be able to compare your inputs and deliverables or activities with involvement? Did you deliver what you promised? Did you reach who you indicated to? And if you're focused on the planning side, you may be all the way back to some of the needs information and resource assessment. So that concept of being clear about your purpose and then matching the evidence can really help sharpen your evaluation practice. Another concept is that evaluation looks differently at different stages of the life cycle of a program. And for those of you with a business background, you'll find this looks precisely like a product life cycle. But the basic concept is that programs go fairly predictably through some stages over the course of their life. There's an initiation phase where you're trying to figure out what choices make the most sense for this particular audience, this particular need, what are the best teaching materials, locations, methodologies, all of those organizing, structuring kinds of choices that you make. Presumably you make some good choices and the program starts to grow. It starts to perform and generate some outcomes and impact. And then with luck, it'll stabilize and perform at a high level for a considerable amount of time. After that, it could go a number of different ways. You could saturate the need and the program basically tail right off in terms of impact. Or if it's a renewing audience or an ongoing need, the program may stabilize for even a longer time. Or something may happen that makes it even more important for people to participate, which takes it even beyond. But the point is, after some level of maturity, a program will eventually transform to another state. So what's the point in terms of evaluation? The point is that different types of evaluation fit different stages of the life cycle. If you're in those early initiation phases, you're really thinking about the process. Are the choices that I'm making the right ones? So you're zeroed right in on reactions, on near-term results, methodology choices, and the like. Once the program stabilizes and starts to move to maturity, you should be shifting to focusing on outcomes. So are we getting the practice changes that we're looking for? Are we starting to get evidence of the long-term results, which are the impacts that we're looking for? The other part of impacts is that you're also being able to make a valid case that the results you're claiming result directly from your program. So this concept of different foci, different purposes of evaluation at different stages can also help you target your evaluation. You can also think in terms of degree of formality. And in the early phases, you can be fairly casual. In the middle or outcome-focused stages, you need to at least be systematic in your approach to be able to make claims. And if you're really looking for hardcore impact documentation, you probably need to shift towards more scientific approaches like comparison groups and the like. So again, the reason for this is to get you to think about, for my particular program, what approaches to evaluation are in fact most relevant. Okay, well that's sort of a backdrop to have you think about purposes, think about life cycle, think about the kinds of evidence. We can now shift towards thinking about the methods that are available to you for program evaluation. One of the games I usually play when I do this in a face-to-face setting is play word association with the participants. And I'll say the words evaluation methods and then ask, what's the first thing that comes to mind? And for most people, what comes to mind is the concept of some kind of a survey, often a written survey. That's what we're cultured to. That's what we use most frequently. But my point today is that evaluation method isn't solely a written survey. The evaluation methods available to you are much richer than that, and we tend not to use that rich array. Given that there are multiple methods, how do you choose the right ones? It depends on lots of different things. The nature of your program, the nature of the participants, your access to the respondents or participants, what your evaluation purposes are, what kinds of outcomes you're interested in, the resources you have available to work with, and the expectations of stakeholders, including funders and collaborators. So let's look at what some of those methods are. Here's a fairly standard list of methods options, and I'll try to briefly characterize each. Document analysis is when you basically collect the documents that are relevant to a program and see what sense you can make of them. So certainly if part of your purpose for evaluation is to be able to document your process and communicate it to someone else, then simple things like program resources and materials, planning notes and the like could be useful documents. Documents can also sometimes be used for assessing program outcomes. So, for example, if you had a workshop series for local reporters trying to improve their reporting on agriculture as an industry, you could then track the papers for some period of time and see if participants in your workshops either expanded or improved their coverage. So, document analysis can be either focused internal or external. If you're looking at things like skills training, things like photos or videos or simulations or demonstrations all can be relevant methods. The point is it needs to be something that's physically observable, but you could, for example, use a before and after video of a student job interview or a youth job interview. Or you could use a participant demo to see whether they've learned pesticide calibration. You could use something like a simulation to see if participants could balance a nutritional content of a menu for a week's period given certain ingredients. So all of these are methods that are looking at skills and provide you different ways of documentation, as can observation. So think about skill-oriented training and having a specific set of criteria that an observer could look for. Or think about specific observable practice changes, so safety practices on the farm that someone with a checklist could assess before and after to see whether the participants had in fact adopted those practices. So a variety of things that are skill-focused. As opposed to individual interviews or individual surveys, you can also conduct surveys or interviews with groups, have a collective conversation using a guided survey instrument. And often the interchange of participants can tease out ideas or observations that wouldn't happen solely or likely to be happen with solely individual input. Case studies are where you identify a small number of participants or situations and really go in depth to try to understand what the experience was for that particular person. Get some very detailed observations about a program that you're not likely to get to with some of the other techniques. Portfolios and journals and logs are all techniques whereby the participants directly provide information during instruction that can give you a basis for evaluation. So if you had a career-oriented workshop series for youth, you could have them build a portfolio of letters of introduction and resumes. You could use some scoring criteria to see how they were doing with that. You could ask someone who is adopting a new approach to cultivation to do a journal or a log of their experience, what worked about it, what didn't work about it, what additional information do they need. Again, directly incorporating the instruction or evaluation as part of the instructive process. We sometimes use exams for things like pesticide certification education. We don't do that very often, but it can be applicable. We many times collect testimonials, either voluntary statements or observations or solicited statements from participants to gain an understanding about the value and satisfaction with a particular program. Occasionally we use review panels where we convene some experts who know about this particular area of programming, can look at what you're doing and provide expert feedback. And then lastly, we still do a fair amount of survey work. It can be web surveys or hard copy surveys, various forms of survey work. But again, my reason for going through the long list is to get you to think about the fact that often there are methods outside of surveys that can both be directly incorporated in the instruction and provide you different or better information than surveys by themselves. So with that kind of notion that there are many different methods available to you, how do you think about the combination of those methods? And one way to do it is to think about what kind of data do they generate. Some methods generate quantitative information, numbers or measures, so things like scaled responses in a survey, things like an exam, things like a structured observation sheet can provide quantitative numbers. You can compare the results for different groups or for different methods. That information can be generalized. Another kind of information, though, is qualitative information. And things like open-ended surveys, case studies, unstructured observation, give you more descriptive information about the program, and can you really clue you into sort of the depth and character of the experience beyond what the simple numbers that are measured in a quantitative method can provide. So what's the best combination? The best combination is to think about, can we blend those methods? Can we use a method that gets a quantitative information to be complemented by qualitative measure? So quantitative measures giving you something that's standardized, can be compared across events, but the qualitative measures really letting you know, was there anything unique about this particular program or approach? And as it says, together they provide a more complete picture than does either alone. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need completely separate methods. For example, in a survey, you can use a mix of quantitative and qualitative questions, open-ended and closed questions. But again, think about mix as you're choosing the methods. One of the concepts that I've already mentioned and we'll come back to a couple times is that evaluation can't just be an end game. And if you think about the methods we just described, some of them can be applied at different phases of implementation. So you can do some of your document collection and even analysis before the actual conduct of the program. You can collect some baseline information. Maybe you have previous evaluations that can inform your work, inform the data that you collect. So a variety of things that you can do before you even get formally started with implementation. During implementation, I already alluded to this when I went through the list of methods, there are a variety of things that you can do in terms of assessment that can inform the instruction itself, that can become part of the instruction. So in effect, you're getting double mileage. You're getting enhanced instruction in an engaging way, but you're also creating some of the information you're going to need for assessment. And then certainly there is the need when you're focused on practice changes and end results to use some of the techniques that tend to be most relevant as follow-up. Follow-up surveys, organized attempts to collect testimonials and review panels. So again, in terms of maximizing your effort, think about when these different methods might be employed, depending on your evaluation purposes. Well, let's now shift to another collection of tools. We've gone through the notion of thinking specifically about your purposes, thinking specifically about the various methods that are available to you. Now, how do you really sharpen what you need to go after? And this set of tools, stakeholder analysis, the purpose statement, evaluation questions, and a simple three-phase approach can help you narrow down even further what your approach is going to look like. The notion of stakeholders, is, at least in the definition that we're using, is very broad. It's anybody that could be affected by the program directly or indirectly, so people who might benefit from the program or have to assume the cost of the program. It could also be people who have influence, direct or indirectly, over the program, so it could be a program committee, it could be a committee in the community responding to what you're doing. And it can also include, in the most general sense, anyone with an interest in the program. Well, what's the point? The point is that as you're approaching program evaluation, those different stakeholders are interested in different kinds of information to assess the relevance and worth of your program. And the extent to which you can anticipate that really can help you target what information is going to be most valuable to collect. And I'll just show you a couple of tools that can help you think about this. This first little device here was developed by our friends at the Cornell Office for Research on Evaluation, and they have you think about proximity to the program. So for a youth program, it would be the youth, parents, and staff who are doing the direct delivery who are closest in, and you can think about what kind of information are they going to need to evaluate the program. Next circle might be volunteers who contribute to the program or teachers, and what kind of information is going to be of most interest to them. Going out a little bit further, who are the funders and maybe collaborators, maybe your bosses, what kind of information there is going to be most relevant, and then out to the widest group. But the intent of this, sort of identifying who the stakeholder groups are, is to then go to what kind of information do I need to collect to respond to their needs. A technique that can help you with that, and really teasing out what specific needs are, is the accountability grid. And basically, once you've identified who the stakeholders are, you use them as the headers for the rows in this grid, and then you start to figure out what specifically do the different stakeholders need in the way of evaluation evidence. So if your particular funder is interested primarily in whether or not you delivered what you said they were, then things like the activities and involvement could be very important. If your coworkers are considering doing a similar program, they might want more evidence around the process choices that you made. So just with those two examples, you can see how what people might be most needing could differ across these groups. And then you can figure out how could that be gathered. If you try to respond to each of these needs independently, you're going to wind up ballooning your evaluation process to an impractical state. So what you really want to look for is what are the commonalities across these groups and across these methods that allow me to make this a more manageable process. I often get asked, well, what are the keys to successful evaluation? What seems to make it or break it for people in terms of their evaluation approach? And I've alluded to a lot of this already in the presentation and what I've covered. But just to restate, a starting point is knowing how the program you are evaluating is supposed to work. What are the results you're really shooting for? What's the connection between your activities and approach? And the best tool that I know for that is the logic model. So doing a logic model can be very helpful in setting you up for a successful evaluation. Being very clear about why you are evaluating. That's why I spent so much time on the different purposes of evaluation, including the CCEPDC model. And then really being clear about what are the questions that need to be answered to meet those purposes. There's a real tendency to jump to the questions that you want to ask people, but it really pays off to spend considerable time thinking about what are the questions I need to answer to meet my evaluation purposes. So with that, with a framework, I'm going to go through some tools that are available to you to help you think about that. A critical one, in my view, is taking the time to write down a purpose statement. It's intended to provide direction to the overall evaluation process. It sets some boundaries in terms of timeline, what is and isn't being considered, and it becomes the guide for your evaluation plan and implementation. So what's it look like? And here's a mocked-up purpose statement for a webinar series for Master Forest owners. And the intent of the evaluation is to decide whether or not that webinar series was effective in supporting and prompting volunteers to extend their knowledge to other forest owners. So did the webinar series both support the volunteers and get them to extend their knowledge? A secondary purpose was for others who might be interested in this kind of approach is to give enough documentation and assessment to allow someone to replicate the model. And then look at that last sentence. It basically says what you're not going to evaluate. It clearly says that our focus is the 2010 webinar series. We're not going to be looking at our newsletters and conference calls. And again, helps you focus down on what your assessment process needs to look like. Once you have the purpose statement, then you can tease out what are the critical evaluation purpose questions or evaluation questions that need to be answered. And here are some that might be considered for the purpose statement we just looked at. Should that webinar series be continued? Did it make any difference in the ability of volunteers to extend their knowledge? And did they, in fact, extend their knowledge? the more specific you can be about these questions, the better off you will be in terms of making good choices for your evaluation design. It really pays off to spend some time working with the wording of those evaluation questions. So here's just a couple of more examples of how questions might roll out of that evaluation purpose statement we looked at. So one variation might be, how well did the workshop prepare the volunteers for the role of extending their knowledge? Once you've got that written, you look at it a while and you start to think, well, what's it mean to be prepared? Do I mean that they have content in their hands or teaching materials? Does it mean that they are skilled in instructional techniques? What do we mean by preparation? And then you can start to tease out what was your intent? What specifically were you looking for in the way of preparation? What's it mean by extending knowledge? Is it enough that they do an occasional newsletter? Or does it mean that they're conducting workshops locally? What do you really mean? A second variation, how well prepared were the workshop's participants for this role? Again, what's it mean to be well prepared? But that question immediately gets you thinking about, if I'm going to make claims about this workshop, I need to know how well prepared they were coming in the door as well as going out the door. So that's the reason for spending time on the evaluation questions. It really starts to tease out your precise interests, which in the language, again, of our friends from Cornell Office for Research on Evaluation, is teasing out the constructs that need to guide the data that you collect. So evaluation purpose statement and then really spending some time on your evaluation questions can be very, very powerful in focusing your evaluation. Often extension educators will come to me just not knowing where to start in terms of thinking about evaluation. Maybe they've just gotten a small grant or contract, or maybe they're writing a proposal and they're looking for a way to frame their approach to evaluation. And I've come up with a simplistic formula that at least gets people started. It's not claimed to be the be-all and end-all, but at least it gives people a starting point. And that's to think about three separate phases. The first phase being, what can we do through straightforward documentation? Just doing a decent job of collecting data, monitoring information, doing detailed enrollment maybe, collecting programmatic documents, all of which can give you both some sense of baseline, but also descriptive information that would allow you to understand the results that you get later. So what can we do in the documentation phase? Then what can we do while we have people in the house, so to speak? What can we do to capture short-term feedback from participants? And maybe it means using some of those techniques we talked about before that incorporate evaluation in the instruction. And then what can we do in a very targeted way in terms of follow-up? The emphasis tends to always shift towards end-game evaluation or post-facto evaluation. If you've taken this kind of an approach, you should be in the position to really target that follow-up so it's more efficient and more likely to generate the kind of information that you need. So again, I don't claim that this is a cure-all, but if you're sort of stuck trying to figure out how do I start envisioning an overall approach, this process seems to be quite helpful for people. All right, so we've talked about the importance of clarity of purpose. We've talked about the range of methods that's available. We've talked about things like matching your program life cycle with your evaluation approaches, the importance of considering those stakeholders, and the kinds of evidence that are going to be required to meet their needs, all of which is an attempt to give you some tools for really targeting, focusing your evaluation effort. So let's assume that you've started to adopt those kinds of approaches, and now you're trying to figure out, well, how do I sustain this? How do I come at evaluation so that it's practically incorporated in my work and doesn't become too costly to be able to actually have time to conduct the programs? And what I have in the next few slides is just some observations from observing extension educators over time and from my own experience that boil down to some broad advice about incorporating program evaluation in your overall processes. So we'll just step through these fairly quickly, and you can take or leave the ones that connect with your own style and approach. The first notion is that if you tried to evaluate everything you did, you wouldn't have any time left over for programming. You can't document or communicate all you do, and you can't do it all at once. So that's the notion of really being targeted, but also the notion of thinking about program evaluation as something you invest in over time to build a bankroll of evaluation information. And the key is to sort of get in the habit. And maybe it's that you and your supervisor make a commitment that you're going to evaluate one aspect of your program every 6 months, or maybe a major program every year, and you're going to cycle through your programs over maybe a 3-year or 5-year cycle. And sooner than you might guess, you're going to start to grow that bankroll of evaluation information that you can build upon and refine for various purposes. So approach it systematically and incrementally to really build that experience and information base. Really target the investment of evaluation activity, and that's really been the purpose of much of what I've covered so far today, is to get you to think about different considerations in selecting your evaluation effort. But let's just replay some of these. Go back to those accountability needs and really focus your evaluation effort on stuff that's really priority, and do it when it's going to be needed. So really sharply thinking about what's going to be needed when. Targeting in the sense of addressing your own decision needs. If you've got a program that you know you're going to be doing forever, that there's really not much need for improvement, I wouldn't think that'd be a great place to invest a lot of formal assessment, unless there's some decisions to be made about it. Think about, for those sort of established programs that you do want to have at least some basic documentation on, can we standardize that? Can we get in the habit of routinely documenting programs, monitoring participation and the like, in ways that take the cost a little bit lower, in that we don't have to invent a process for every program. So can we come up with some standard basic documentation? Think about that life cycle, and don't do formal evaluation too early and informal evaluation too late. Either is a wasted effort, and really target in that sense. And then the concept of cycling through your major programs. Really keep in mind that different forms and methods of evaluation count for different purposes. That concept of matching your evaluation methods to those purposes so that you're sure that you're going to get results that are valuable. If you lock onto a favorite set of methods, use them to try to address all purposes, odds are it may not be a wise investment over the longer haul. I tend to get suspect of routine evaluation practices where I'll talk with a group of educators and they say, well, this is the approach we use for everything we do. Well, often what becomes routine may be generating information that's not very targeted. Often we wind up generating information that's not used very effectively. So there's nothing wrong with routinizing common needs, but if you find you're sort of getting to a cookie-cutter approach to program evaluation, I'd really ask you to sort of question yourself about that and say, am I matching my priority needs with what I'm doing in evaluation practice? This is sort of a cutesy way of stating something that I've said before in terms of considering evaluation as an investment. So if the former didn't connect with you, maybe this will. I tend to think about building a baseline or a floor of basic documentation and monitoring. for any major program, you're going to want some documentation, monitoring information to be able to know how you're doing and be able to describe that to funders and sponsors. So what are some of the standard approaches that you're going to use? Again, watching the trap of becoming so routinized that you're mismatching purposes, but can we figure out some common approaches that will build that baseline? Then really selectively go after more formal assessment on a rotating basis. So you've got the base descriptive information. You can really characterize what you're doing, who you're reaching, what some common results are. But then you can really hang a star on it by saying, here's what we were able to achieve with these different programs. And we know we did that because we did some structured evaluation to get there. So the floor is the basic documentation. Raising the roof is really nailing some of those more targeted program evaluation results. There are some traps, and I think I may have mentioned most of these already. Treating all information needs as separate. It'll just swamp you in no time. Trying to do assessment on everything you do. Treating evaluation as an end process. Not taking the time to focus your purposes and your questions. Over-reliance on standard methods. Asking the wrong questions at the wrong time, or the right questions at the wrong time. That's the life cycle concept. And then not using data that you're generating. If you're generating data and not finding a use for it, you really should be questioning, do I really need to go through the formality of collecting that information? The concept of building evaluation in, we've talked about several times. You need to do some pre-planning to be able to do that. Think about what the needs are. Think about what the evidence is. Think about your evaluation questions. Look for evaluation data that may already exist from colleagues or previous evaluation you've done. And then build the evaluation in the instruction. And as I showed you before, the various techniques that can contribute to the instruction, the various self-documenting techniques, allowing you then to really target your follow-up on specific questions or practice changes. And just to replay, here are some of those self-documenting approaches again. Some that you didn't see before, some of the fast feedback forms, giving people sticky dots and scaled responses in the front of the room, so at the break they can give you some quick feedback. Using classroom clickers to do some survey work, feedback work. The vote with your feet continuum, you put either different responses to questions at different points in the room, have people walk to the one that best reflects their feeling, and then have the groups each talk about why they're standing where they are. It can be really a rich way to get some perspective on the nature of a program. And then interviewing a partner, have participants talk to each other about what their observations are, and then share out the results from that. So a variety of self-documenting approaches available to you. That's generally the content I wanted to cover. And again, just to replay, really to get started with program evaluation, you should be very specific about your purposes. Think about who's interested and what the data needs are. Think about what the evaluation questions are that you need to respond to, the kinds of evidence, and then match the methods that you choose to your purposes and evidence. And then figure out how you're going to approach this across programs over time in a practical way that makes it a manageable set of commitments. So a lot of different ideas, but all of which was intended to help you come up with an evaluation approach and strategy that fits your programming context. I do want to, just before I close, point out to you that there are a number of additional resources that can be quite helpful to you. There is an online course for this module itself, Getting Started with Program Evaluation, which is PDC 142. That was recently updated extensively. If you go through the online course and do the activities, you actually prepare an evaluation plan, which could be quite handy for you. There are 3 other modules, one of which is fully complete, Designing Survey Instruments, and 2 which will be available before the end of 2012, Managing Data and Putting Evaluation Results to Work. So some structured online courses that include many links to additional resources. And then I'll just close with the pitch again for the Cornell Office for Research and Evaluation and the exceptional resources on the systems evaluation protocol. So with that, we'll call it a wrap, and I thank you for your attention.